All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we are diving deep into a truly fascinating and maybe just a little bit morbid corner of New York City's history.
Morbid, but definitely fascinating.
We're talking about the 19th century New York morgue. Now, our source material today comes from an episode of the After Dark podcast.
Ooh, good one.
And let me tell you, it is absolutely packed with intriguing details
Yeah.
about death photography, this kind of, ghoulish location.
Yeah.
And even some tales of corruption that really reveal a lot about, well, how society viewed death, especially for those who were, let's say, often overlooked.
Right. Those on the margins of society.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm so excited to unpack all of this with our expert here, who, well, I won't lie, I'm learning right alongside you all today.
Always happy to dive into the darker side of history, you could say.
Okay, so first, let's just set the scene a little bit, right?
Right.
New York City in the late 1800s.
Oh, wow.
It
Yeah.
was a completely different world.
Can you imagine a city just exploding with new arrivals?
Yeah.
Waves and waves of immigrants seeking opportunity?
And not all of them finding it, I imagine.
Sadly, no, not all of them. And this created such a stark contrast. You had opulent wealth right alongside poverty-stricken slums.
It's like the Gilded Age, but with a much, much darker underbelly.
Precisely. Crime was rampant. Disease was everywhere. The city was really struggling to manage this rapid, just out-of-control growth.
I can only imagine. And it was within this context, right? This very specific context that the New York morgue was established.
Yep. In 1865.
1865. Okay. Now, I understand it was modeled after the Paris morgue, but with some key differences.
Oh, absolutely. Big differences.
Oh, and I always think of the Paris morgue as being almost like, a tourist attraction.
Right, almost a spectacle. Yeah.
So was that the case in New York?
Not at all. The New York morgue, which, by the way, was located at Bellevue Hospital.
Okay.
It was much, much smaller. And it definitely had a much more, I'd say, clinical focus.
So less about morbid curiosity, more about what practical necessity in a city that was growing so fast.
You got it. The sheer volume of unclaimed bodies just required a system, right?
Right.
A system for identification, both for, for legal purposes and to try to bring closure to families searching for their loved ones.
Right, because imagine back then, no social media, no widespread communication.
It's hard for us to fathom that now, isn't it?
It really is.
Oh.
So you have all these people coming to the city, disappearing.
Vanishing without a trace.
And the morgue is sort of like this last hope for identification.
Exactly. And that's where the photography comes in, right?
Yeah. Tell me about that. They actually photographed the unclaimed dead.
They did, and it's fascinating. The morgue photographer, his name was Oscar G. Mason.
Okay.
Now, he actually had a background in medical photography.
Interesting. I didn't realize medical photography was a thing back then.
Oh, it was a growing field, particularly after the Civil War.
Right.
Photographs were increasingly used for medical documentation.
I guess that makes sense, but it does seem almost counterintuitive, right?
You would think so, wouldn't you?
Like, on the one hand, you have medical photography. It's about healing. It's about advancement.
Right, pushing science forward.
But then these photos of the morgue, they're documenting death.
It is a fascinating juxtaposition. But you have to remember that these photographs weren't meant to be, sentimental keepsakes.
Right.
They served a very, very specific purpose to identify the unknown.
And I guess in that way, they are medical, even though they're also about death.
Exactly. It's like they blended elements of medical photography with criminal mugshots, which, by the way, were already pretty common in New York at the time.
Oh, right. The Rogues Gallery, wasn't it?
That's the one. And of course, there was the tradition of postmortem photography, but these morgue photos were different.
Yeah. They had this very specific function.
A very practical purpose in a chaotic city.
Now, we actually have one of these photographs here.
Oh, wow.
It's of a man named Peter Van Geen.
Peter Van Geen. Let's see.
And just looking at his photo, it's striking. He's surprisingly young, only 45.
He is, yes. But you can see the marks of a hard life etched on his face, can't
You
you?
really can. And even the details of his clothing. A somewhat worn three-piece suit. It hints at his social standing, right?
It does. And what's really sad is he was found drowned and remained unidentified for 5 months.
5 months? That's a long time to be unclaimed.
It is. And it makes you wonder, what was his story?
Did anyone ever come looking for him?
Exactly. And that's the poignant reality behind these photographs, isn't it?
Yeah.
They represent lives lost, often forgotten, and they really underscore the importance of identification, even in death, for those left behind.
It's almost like even in death we have this need to be acknowledged, you know?
A basic human need to be remembered, to have someone know that your life, however humble, mattered.
And I guess that's what makes these photos so powerful.
They are, and they also raise questions about how society treated its dead.
Especially the unclaimed, the marginalized.
Exactly. It reveals a lot about their values, their priorities.
Right. So are you saying the way society treated the dead was a reflection of their social hierarchy?
Precisely. You think about the expense of death rituals,
Right.
the stark reality of Potter's Field, the mass grave on Hart Island where most of the unclaimed ended up.
It's like those who couldn't afford a proper burial were just discarded.
It's a sobering thought, and it speaks volumes about the social dynamics of the time.
Now, we also have this photo of the morgue's dead house, I guess they called it.
The dead house, huh?
Yeah, their coffin storage room.
Oh, wow. That's
And what's interesting is there are these animal skeletons in the background.
animal skeletons. What kind?
An elk and an ostrich.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to ask, why were those there?
Well, this is where things get a bit surreal. They actually built a comparative anatomy museum above the morgue.
Wait, a museum above a morgue?
Yep. And those skeletons were probably new additions to the museum's collection.
That's a jarring contrast, isn't it? Life and death just stacked on top of each other.
It does seem strange, doesn't it?
It does. But maybe it reflects the complexities of those concepts, how they were viewed back then?
Maybe. And speaking of complexities, there's also the fact that we have so few records from the New York morgue.
That's true. Why is that? Do we know?
Well, some people say it's because of hurricane damage,
Oh,
but others, they suspect something more deliberate,
like what?
possibly to cover up the corruption that was pretty rampant within the institution.
Ooh, a conspiracy. I love it.
It definitely adds to the mystery, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And speaking of corruption, I cannot wait to delve into the story behind this headline. And this is a real headline. Used to corpses for targets.
Whoa, hold on. Used to corpses for targets.
Yeah, intense, right?
Yeah, that sounds pretty intense.
So that's coming up next, but first we need to take a quick break.
Okay, I need a minute to process that headline anyway.
We'll be right back. It's crazy to think that they were literally shooting corpses.
Yeah, that's a pretty disturbing image.
It is, but it also kind of makes you think, right, about the ethics of it all.
Definitely.
I mean, on the one hand, it's horrifying,
Yeah.
but on the other, I guess you could argue they were trying to advance medical knowledge.
It's a slippery slope, isn't it?
It really is.
Using the bodies of those who couldn't consent, couldn't speak for themselves.
Yeah, the most vulnerable members of society.
Exactly. And this wasn't just Dr. Phelps either.
Right. It wasn't using unclaimed bodies for medical experimentation. Fairly common back then.
It was, unfortunately.
I remember reading somewhere that the first U.S. skin graft from a deceased person
Oh, yeah.
that was performed using a body from the New York morgue.
It's true. It's a really complex issue, right? I mean, we can appreciate the advancements that came from it.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, it raises these really big ethical questions.
Questions about consent, about exploitation.
These questions that, honestly, we're still grappling with today.
Like the echoes of the past,
Haunting us in a way.
And speaking of echoes, let's talk about Albert Napoleon White.
Albert.
The corrupt morgue keeper. His story is just wild.
It's a classic tale of greed, isn't it?
It really is. So he was the keeper for 25 years, earning a modest salary.
Modest, very modest.
But, get this, when he died, his estate was worth, are you ready for this?
Uh-oh.
$100,000.
$100,000 in the 19th century. I know, it's an insane amount of money.
That's like millionaire status back then.
More than that, probably.
So how did he amass that kind of wealth?
Well, after he died, a bunch of doctors came forward.
What?
They admitted to buying corpses from him.
Oh, wow. Buying corpses. So that's where the money came from.
Apparently they were delivered by express wagon.
The express wagon, like right to their doorstep.
Pretty much. Packed in wicker baskets, no less.
That's so creepy.
And one doctor even claimed to have paid $3,000 for, a bulk deal.
$3,000?
Yeah.
For a bunch of bodies.
The market was clearly booming.
Wow. Okay, let's do the math here.
Right.
If we average, let's say, the price per corpse to about $8.
That means he sold approximately 12,500 bodies.
12,500.
It's mind-boggling.
Body snatching was big business.
Clearly.
And White obviously had, a whole network.
Oh, yeah, he had to.
To support his operation. paying people off to look the other way.
The whole system was corrupt, top to bottom.
And what's even more messed up is that when he was finally caught,
Yeah.
the trial, it focused solely on him,
They made him the scapegoat.
completely ignoring the wider system of corruption.
I guess they had to protect the more respectable members of society.
The doctors, the officials who are also profiting.
Right. It's always the little guy who takes the fall.
But I'm curious about White himself, you know.
You too. What kind of a guy was he?
Well, we know he was born in Canada,
Okay.
moved to the U.S., fought in the Civil War, and somehow ended up as the morgue keeper.
What a journey.
Right. And his personal life was a bit dramatic, too.
Oh, tell me more.
His wife, she died from an illegal abortion.
Wow, what?
And just 6 months later, he married a younger woman who was, get this, already living in their house.
What?
I know. But the thing is, the press portrayed him as this, like, jolly, cheerful morgue man.
What? No way.
Seriously. Like the friendly neighborhood undertaker.
It's amazing how people can present such a different face to the world.
It makes you wonder what secrets people are hiding, right?
Right. It's like that saying, everybody has a skeleton in their closet, literally in this case.
And that's just one story from the New York morgue.
One of many, I'm sure.
Who knows how many more are hidden, lost to time.
It's both fascinating and a little bit unsettling.
It is. But hey, before we get too lost in the shadows,
Yeah.
let's shift gears for a moment.
Okay.
Because I think it's time we talked about the fate of the morgue itself.
What happened to the building?
And what about Potter's Field? Those unclaimed souls on Hart Island.
It's a story that deserves to be told.
So let's dive back in, shall we?
Mhm.
You know, it's strange. We started by talking about photos
Mm.
and ended up in this whole world of corruption and social injustice.
It's all connected, though, isn't it?
I guess it is, yeah. But the story that really sticks with me, it's Hart Island.
Yeah, it's hard to shake that one off.
It's still in use today, right?
It is.
Like a real tangible reminder that the issues we saw back in the 19th century, they haven't gone away.
Yeah, poverty,
It's
marginalization.
like history repeating itself.
Sadly.
Yeah.
And the fact that for over a century, people were buried there by a system that basically incarcerated the poor and marginalized.
Inmates burying the dead. It's
pretty disturbing when you think about it.
It is, and it makes you question, you know, what do we really value as a society?
How do we treat the most vulnerable among us?
Exactly.
And are we any better today than we were back then?
It's a tough question, but at least there's been some progress with Hart Island, right?
Yeah, there has. Shifting the management from the Department of Corrections to the Department of Parks.
That's got to be a good thing, right?
It is. It's a step towards more respect, more dignity.
Recognizing that everyone deserves a decent burial, no matter who they were or how much money they had.
Exactly. But it's just a start. We need to keep pushing, keep challenging the systems that create these inequalities in the first place.
It's like history's giving us a warning, right?
So, yeah.
Like, hey, pay attention, learn from the past, make things better.
And don't forget the people who were silenced, marginalized.
The ones whose stories were erased.
The ones who ended up in the New York morgue in Potter's Field.
They mattered.
Their lives mattered.
It's humbling, isn't it?
It is.
To realize that behind each photo, each name in the morgue register,
There was a person.
with hopes, dreams, struggles, just like us.
And their stories deserve to be remembered.
Even if they ended in anonymity.
Exactly. Their stories challenge us, make us uncomfortable.
And force us to look in the mirror, I guess.
I think so.
Yeah.
To see how we're complicit in the systems that perpetuate injustice.
To ask ourselves, are we doing enough to make things better?
To make sure everyone's story is valued, is heard.
I never thought a deep dive into the New York morgue would lead to all this.
Me neither. But that's the thing about history.
It's full of surprises.
And unexpected connections.
It's not just dates and events. It's about people.
Real people with real lives.
And sometimes, the darkest corners reveal the most profound truths.
This whole deep dive has been a powerful reminder of that.
So thank you for taking us on this journey.
It's been a pleasure.
And for those of you listening, keep digging, keep exploring.
History is out there, waiting to be discovered.
You never know what you might find.
And what it might teach you.
So until next time, stay curious.
And keep those deep dives going.